I'll start by being upfront about something. Walking into this film, I had a specific kind of hope. Not a blind optimism, but a careful hope that someone carries when something has genuine potential and you somewhere actually want it to work out. Because on paper, this thing should not have been able to fail. Priyadarshan back in the director's chair for a horror comedy, backed by Akshay Kumar, Paresh Rawal, and Rajpal Yadav. That is genuinely a recipe for something special and entertaining. And the timing felt right too. The horror comedy space in Bollywood has still been buzzing. Audiences are clearly hungry for this stuff if it's done well. So here comes the man Priyadarshan, who arguably started this whole conversation in Hindi cinema, returning exactly to this territory with a genuinely loaded ensemble cast. And then something doesn't quite land. And slowly, over the course of nearly 2 hours and 40 minutes, that cautious hope starts deflating. Not dramatically like a balloon popping, but more like an air slowly leaking out. A quiet, creeping disappointment that's almost worse than outright failure. Bhoot Bangla is a film that had very conceivable advantage going in, and still it couldn't find its footing. That's genuinely interesting to me. Not just as a disappointing movie-going experience, but as a case worth examining. So that's what we will dig into today. Not just whether the film works, but why it doesn't, and what that tells us about how cinema, nostalgia, and creative ambition interact. So let's get started with this. The ghost in the room. Before we talk about anything else about this film, we have to address what is essentially the central creative challenge Bhoot Bangla set for itself and then immediately struggled with. Bhool Bhulaiya came out in 2007, which is nearly 2 decades ago. And here's the remarkable thing about that film. It doesn't feel like a period piece. You can easily watch it today and it still holds up. The comedy still lands, the mystery still works, and the dramatic escalation still pulls you in. There's a reason that it lives so vividly in our collective memory. It actually earned that place. The film was genuinely smart about how it handled tone. It was funny without being stupid, scary without being cheap, and dramatically surprising in a way that made its climax feel truly earned. So now when Priyadarshan decides to return to this world with this aesthetic and with these performers, then he immediately and unavoidably get pulled in the conversation on how they maintain that legacy with this one. And what's really strange about Bhoot Bangla is that it doesn't just acknowledge this piece of conversation, it practically shouts it from the rooftop. There's this Haveli setting, plus the promotional music echoes that iconic devotional energy. There are those same veteran actors, so automatically the film was essentially waving a flag that was saying that remember that thing you love, we are doing that thing again. But now here's the critical issue with that strategy. The people who loved Bhool Bhulaiya don't just love the aesthetic of it. They actually love the story of it. They love the mystery there. They love the way it genuinely surprised them. There was something psychologically interesting happening. And when makers themselves remind those people of the original by recreating its surface, all they are doing is making them remember exactly why the original was so great. And then the audience spend the rest of your film noticing how you measure up. And Bhoot Bangla does not measure up at all. A mythology worth believing in. Now here's something I genuinely want to give the film credit for. The legend of Vadhusur, which is a demonic entity that has haunted a village for generations, abducting brides before their wedding nights and essentially bringing matrimonial life in the entire village to a halt. That's legitimately a compelling piece of dark folk mythology. Though it does remind me of the plot of one of the classic horror movies, Jani Dushman by Rajkumar Kohli. But still, there's something deeply unsettling about the image of a community that is living indefinitely under the weight of a supernatural curse, generation after generation choosing not to marry. Plus, the setting of the film in the early 2000s is a smart instinct as well. The deliberate removal of smartphones and instant information access means the supernatural can breathe. This isolation feels earned by the period rather than manufactured. And the setup of an urban family inheriting an ancestral place they knew nothing about in a village that carries dark secrets about their own bloodline, that also looks like a solid foundation. And ancestral homes in this type of storytelling carry inherent dramatic weight. But still, the tragedy is that Bhoot Bangla never fully commits to any of this. The mythology gets introduced in the start, creates some initial curiosity, and then largely parked sideways while the comedy takes over. When the mythology resurfaces in the second half, it does so through flashback sequence that feels rushed and somewhat convoluted, as it looks like the screenplay was trying to retroactively give way to a world it didn't spend enough time properly building. Let's take 3 as the obvious comparison comparison here. The film spent real time making its central supernatural legend feel culturally lived in. By the time you got to the horror elements, you believed in that world. You felt the folklore as something with genuine roots. But here Vadhusur never quite achieves that same reality. To me, it just felt like a genre device more than a breathing piece of mythology. A film at war with itself. One of the more technically revealing failures of Bhoot Bangla is what happens structurally at the interval point and beyond it. The first half of the movie is broadly a Priyadarshan slapstick comedy, which is loud, physical, energetic and driven by the chemistry between the main cast. It definitely has momentum even when the specific gags were repetitive or familiar. But then the interval comes and the film essentially decides to become a different kind of movie, which is darker, more horror focused and with extended sequences of Akshay Kumar alone in the mansion confronting the supernatural. Now this kind of tonal shift is not inherently a problem. Many great horror comedies shift their tone deliberately and meaningfully, but this shift only works when the comedy and the horror are telling the same story. When the laughs of the first half are in some way feeding into the darkness of the second half. This creates a relationship between the two modes, and when that relationship exists, the shift feels like escalation. But when it doesn't, it just feels like two separate films have been cut together. In Bhoot Bangla, the comedy and the horror feel almost entirely disconnected from each other thematically. The gags of the first half don't set up anything that the horror of the second half pays off. They're just two different tones and movies sitting in the same runtime. This somewhere also creates a pacing problem that compounds as the film progresses. Horror comedies build themselves by escalating absurdity and atmospheric dread, and this tends to work best when they are lean and propulsive. So every minute of unnecessary runtime is a minute during which the audience has the time to notice the structural weaknesses, and this film gives the audience a lot of time to notice. The nostalgia economy. We are now living in a moment of intense nostalgia mining in Indian mainstream cinema. We witness legacy sequels, reunions, spiritual successors, etc. Because I think the industry has figured out that the audience will show up for things that trigger warm memories of what they have previously loved. And sometimes this produces genuinely good films. But Bhoot Bangla becomes a case study in what happens when nostalgia becomes the product itself, rather than the context for a product. The film's implicit promise was that we are giving you Bhool Bhulaiya feelings again. But those feelings can't be manufactured through aesthetic replication. They were produced by a specific storytelling choices where there is a mystery, the character depth, the tonal daring and the surprise of the climax, which Bhoot Bangla fails to replicate. Instead of delivering that feeling, it just keeps pointing at the source of the feeling, which only makes the absence more pronounced. There's also something worth saying about what this approach communicates to the audience. When you trade heavy on nostalgia without putting in the creative work to back it up, you are implicitly telling your audience that their affection is something to be spent rather than reciprocated. Audiences who have grown up and who have watched more films, who are now more sophisticated than they were when they first fell in love with Bhool Bhulaiya, they actually feel that. Maybe not consciously in the moment, but it's part of why the disappointment lands as hard as it does. I think the more interesting creative choice would have been to make something entirely new by taking these performers, this genre, this director's instincts and build something that stands completely on its terms. Something that doesn't need the nostalgia of Bhool Bhulaiya hovering over it to justify its existence. That film, in my opinion, might have been something genuinely worth celebrating. I think Bhoot Bangla is not a disaster. It has moments of genuine comedy and a premise with a real potential lurking underneath its execution problems. The first half had enough energy to keep viewers provisionally engaged. But in spite of all of this, it's a deeply frustrating film. Because this wasn't supposed to be a long shot bet that didn't come off. This was supposed to be a sure thing where the director, the cast, the genre and the legacy, all of it pointed towards something that should have worked.
शादी यहीं करेंगे, it is confirmed.
मंगलपुर में कोई शादी नहीं करता, वधूसुर आएगा.
So now that concludes few of my thoughts on view on the film Bhoot Bangla. You too, please share your thoughts in the comment section of the video about this film and let's have a healthy discussion around it. Also, if you have enjoyed this overall discussion, so please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel for more content ahead. Do follow me on my social handles at Cinesamvad for short reviews and cinematic insights. Thank you for watching. We'll meet in the next one. Cheers.